Hello, my name is Ben-Youssef, and I'm a Global Perspectives on Society Teaching Fellow at NYU Shanghai. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Richard Peña, former director of Lincoln Center and current Columbia University film professor. Today we'll be speaking about the film A Touch of Sin by Jia Zhangke, along with his general curatorial philosophy and approach to the New York Film Festival during his tenure there as program director.
再拖了。
怎么不在广州干呢？
做衣服没前途。
我经常给矿承包给省里的时候，说好了每年都有分红。
瞧瞧地吧，
你不跟我说，到时候你跟中纪委人说。
收到过你2笔钱，一共13万。
那都对了噻。
我不要你的钱。
不干，又一个，哪一个？就是个。
截至目前，事故已经造成35人遇难。
你是叫小玉吧？不是叫你老婆。
晚上客人多吗？
不好说，凌晨1点一波。
你能不能当着全村人的面说一说村里的经济问题？
我再不是搞到肩膀里了。
还没得钱啊？
我不是小姐，回家找你老婆去。
就这样。
要丢钱不行，要丢钱不行。
你们要怪，都怪老天爷。有啥子想不通，都去问他。
So I thought it might be a good idea to start with that film, given that we featured it at the Global Perspectives on Society film series, and also because you introduced it. And something that struck me in the film was the use of the critical blurbs related to Jia Zhangke, most notably that he is, according to the New Yorker, what do they say? Simply one of the best and most important directors in the world. And watching this, I was wondering if you could offer us some perspective of how the director came to be known globally, and more broadly, how does an artist like Jia Zhangke move onto the world stage?
Okay, well, it's sort of a long story. I mean, you have to sort of go back to the 80s when, in a certain way, you could say the West, broadly speaking, discovered Chinese cinema, especially in the People's Republic. There was some awareness by then, of course, of Hong Kong, at the same time an awareness of Taiwan, but People's Republic was really with the fifth generation that, in a sense, people began to see and appreciate contemporary cinema from China. So in the 80s up until the early 90s, figures such as Chen Kaige and Zhang Yimou, Chang Shuangzhuang, and a few others were, of course, seen as major directors, and their works were regularly featured in the main festivals. Zhang Yimou won a few festivals, certainly won Cannes, or Berlin rather, with Red Sorghum. Chen Kaige won or co-won Cannes with Farewell My Concubine. So, I mean, they were really flying very high. But by the mid-1990s, a certain disenchantment with them came in. There was always a little bit of complaint about their work, in that their work was too epic, it was a little too aesthetic, it didn't deal with China today, that it dealt very abstractly with issues like Chinese history. Some of those criticisms, I think, aren't really fair, because obviously artists can find their own way. But anyway, that seemed to come in, and we already knew that there was the existence of something called the sixth generation, and these were younger directors whose work was much more focused on everyday China, and especially about urban life. And there were a couple of good films and good directors who seemed to emerge, but nobody who seemed as really mature and skilled as Jia Zhangke, who, with his first film, Pickpocket, Xiao Wu, in 1997, I think, already established himself as someone to watch. And, as always, when that happens, it's a little bit nerve-wracking, a little bit scary when they come out with the second film. But of course, the second film was Platform, which went on to become just a huge, huge art house hit. Popular hit, but certainly enormously well-respected, well-regarded film that showed in many of the major festivals and things like that. And with that, you could say he was really on his way. By then, aside from all the critical acclaim, he also sort of got himself in, not so much in line, but within the area of international co-production. So that really helped him a lot, since his films had trouble with the censors in China. He could always depend on the ability to get money from Japan or from France or from other places so that he could continue working.
And it's helpful to sort of see Jia's trajectory, but in that spirit, what was your role as program director of Lincoln Center in bringing artists to the world stage? How did you facilitate that process, Richard?
Well, we were lucky enough to see Xiao Wu and like it very much, and showed it in our series called New Directors, New Films. And at the time, I would say that, along with other people, I thought he was a very promising talent. You're always eager to see where he'll go or whatever. And then it's actually a funny story about Platform. We were close to the end of our selection process in 2000, and we'd had a lot of very long films that year. So my selection committee was a little bit fatigued and, maybe a little bit grumpy. And so I got a phone call from Shozo Ishiyama, the Japanese producer of Platform. He said, Jia Zhangke just finished his film and we really want to rush it to you. And I said, gee, it's, Tuesday or something. I mean, we only have till Friday. Can you really get it to me? He said, yes, I'm putting on some special courier tonight. You'll have it tomorrow morning. Okay, so Wednesday comes along, and indeed it shows up. But we had a lot of other things to see that day, so we didn't see it until everybody left about 8 o'clock. And I was still there, and I figured, well, let me put it on and have a look at it and see what I think. And, about 3 hours later, I finished, and I was absolutely convinced I'd just seen a masterpiece, a film that was, one of the great films of the 1990s, or actually the very 2000s. So I guess one of the first great films of the 21st century. So the next day, when my group got together, I told them, I've got good news and I've got bad news. And they said, what's the good news? And I said, well, the good news is last night, I think I saw a real masterpiece. So they said, oh, that's great. Wonderful. What is it? And I said, well, the bad news is it's over 3 hours. So at that point, they were like ready to throw me out the window. So I said, no, listen, you've got to see this. You're not going to believe how good this film is. And so anyway, so we put it on, and certainly within half an hour, everybody was saying, of course we're going to show this, So, I mean, it just became another long film that we showed that year alongside a number of other long films.
Well, just for those who don't know, you mentioned the committee. How did you select films at the New York Film Festival?
The New York Film Festival had sort of a two-step process. There was a kind of gate, of which I was the gatekeeper, in which, we would get, by that point, we're getting well over 2,000 films. So, I would try and go through all of them, really, at least, give each one 10 or 15 minutes or whatever. Or, of course, I traveled quite a bit and I saw a lot of films that way. And then I would sort of put together a list of finalists, maybe about 100 or so films. And, the New York Film Festival only shows about 25 films. So, in a way, that's a bad thing. And in another way, it's a very good thing, because, clearly, I at least came to believe that I could figure out pretty quickly whether or not a film was even going to be in the ballpark. Wow. If you were going to be in the top 150, that meant that still 125 of you weren't going to get in. So, I mean, it was a pretty tough racket in that way. So I would, give them a list of my colleagues. There were 4 colleagues in addition to myself, a list of about 100 films or so, and probably 50 would drop out right away. People would say, oh, I saw that, I didn't like it, or we'd put it on, we say, well. But then the last 50 was really tough, because you really had to figure out exactly. We didn't have, for example, an expanding calendar. We only had a certain number of slots. We had to fill those slots. In fact, every time we took a long film, like Platform, or that year also Eureka, it cut in. I think we had to have one less film that year, because these films were so long, they simply took over slots. So anyway, that's what happened.
Well, it's odd because I think this sort of brings us to a broader question of what your programming philosophy was. How would you describe that, and how did it develop over time?
You could say I had the easiest programming job in the world in a way, because I had, in a sense, absolute freedom to show what I wanted. I mean, the New York Film Festival, not through any fault of my own, but since about the mid-1970s, has been enormously popular. And so because of that, it regularly sells out, way over 90% of its seats for every film. So because of that, we have a very faithful audience that has come to believe that we make good choices, and they buy films blindly, just thinking, well, if these guys have chosen it, it must be good. So I never really had to worry too much. I mean, I guess if we had really begun losing audience or getting, consistently horrible reviews, someone would have said something, but nobody did. I mean, every year I just had the chance to show what I wanted. And, again, there were figures who at first some of my board members didn't understand at all. And then years later, when they became consecrated, would send me a note saying, I can see you were right. Michael Haneke, for example, I can remember when we showed Benny's video, a number of our board members being very upset by the film and saying, what are you showing stuff? Well, this is really crazy or sick or something. And then, of course, when he goes on to win the Oscar, years later, they go, oh, well, we were there first or something like that. So, but as I said, I was very lucky because I didn't really have anyone saying, this year we only had 93% attendance. What's going on? I mean, I had a board and a staff that completely backed what we were doing. And so that was it. In terms of philosophy, I mean, I just think that the festival has a reputation and had a strong relationship with its public that really expected that we were showing the absolute best that we found every year, without regards really to who made it or where it came from or what it was about or things like that. So on the one hand, it was a very literate, very cultured audience that really could see very difficult films and figure them out. And on the other, it was a very demanding audience that was there, and if they saw something they felt shouldn't have been at the festival, they let me know about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's odd because you're speaking of the possibility of a very wide range of films from across cultures, just in terms of your citations. And it brings me to something you said in one of your earlier essays about globalization in film. You noted something to the effect of, in fact, globalization has been, in one form or another, a factor of film history since the beginning of the medium. And, given our interest in, global perspectives, I was just wondering if you could further elaborate on this idea and maybe sort of tell us a little bit about how the idea of world cinema has developed throughout your career.
Well, there's two different concepts. I mean, because the technology of film was standardized so quickly, I mean, really by 1903, 1904, there were no major variants in film size, film gauge, projection equipment, whatever. It was really standard all over the world. It meant quite literally that films made in China could be shown in Peru. So because of that, what happened was that first the French and then others began to very aggressively export their films because there was no reason not to be able to show the films you had made in France for the French anywhere else in the world. So the French became extremely aggressive exporters. It's estimated that in a year like 1911, maybe 50% of all films shown in the United States were French films, followed by the Italians, who were also very aggressive exporters. U.S. industry didn't really begin exporting until about 1915 in any serious way. But then, of course, they took over world markets, a position from which they haven't left. So that's one way of looking at world cinema in terms of the world film economy and how the U.S. dominates it. Another concept of world cinema I would liken to the use of the word world in the same way that people use it, say, for world music, which is that you now have, thanks to both film schools and changes in the availability of films, an enormous number of films that are available to filmmakers all over the world. So it's no longer unusual to speak with an Argentine director and have him or her talk to you about how influenced they are by Iranian cinema, or to speak to a Finnish director and have him or her talk about their great admiration for Ozu. So that's what I think of world cinema. I think that more and more that people have really gone way beyond their national or even regional boundaries to become aware of cinema quite, extensively, really all over the world. And so I think of world cinema in that sense of being a kind of cinema that, whatever its cultural roots are, is clearly aware of and often quite influenced by cinema from the most distant reaches of the planet.
And so do you think that you noticed a difference in terms of your audience in terms of their receptivity from early in your career to different kinds of cinema versus at the end? Or did you always feel that your highly literate audience, as you mentioned in New York, was always game for whatever films you've brought to them, as it were?
Let's say that there are highly literate audiences with an S in the end, because there wasn't just one audience. And surely there were people who really didn't like what I was doing at all. I mean, several times people came up to me in odd places and told me, you really ruined the festival. It used to be a very serious endeavor and now it's crap. Well, I mean, for them, they couldn't see or understand or care about films from China and Asia and Latin America. I mean, that just wasn't their thing. They, very much liked a certain kind of European 60s cinema, and that's what they were looking forward to. I like that cinema a lot, too. That's the cinema I was raised on. But, I think the cinema had moved on. And one of the great things that had now become truly international, and many of the great names of cinema were no longer European names. So anyway, of course, I took my knocks, as we all did. But happily, in a city like New York, there were more than enough other people to take their place. I think there were new audiences that began coming in, sometimes for ethnic reasons, sometimes just because we began to show a kind of cinema to which they could relate much more.
Well, it reminds me this notion of New York as a space of programming. I was very curious reading some past interviews with you where you touched upon how New York changed during the period that you were program director of the Lincoln Center, and some initiatives you had in bringing some diasporic communities to engage with your programming. And so I was just wondering, how did you find the city itself shape your programming, and how would you describe your initiatives to engage different parts of the city into your film work?
Well, as anyone who's lived in New York, and I'm a New Yorker, I haven't lived here all my life, but I certainly spent the lion's share of my time here. And even when I lived away, I would come in quite often. We've seen that New York has changed a lot. I mean, as we know, we know nationally, immigration largely stopped in the United States in the 1920s, but then picked up again in the 60s. Only this time it was a different kind of immigration. Many people from Asia, people from the Arab world, more and more Latins, Africa, I mean, all kinds of people. So that by the time I took over the festival in 1988, New York had become a very immigrant city once again. We had a lot of people who were first or second generation, still with very strong ties to their communities, to their countries. But now, of course, they were countries that were different than the old category. It was no longer Ireland, Italy, Poland, or, whatever. It was now, Iran. It was now Argentina. It was now a lot of other places. So, in a way, I think my programming didn't set out to just play on that. But I mean, I think as cinema itself became more and more accessible and we had the chance to show more and more films, we knew that there were communities to which we could reach out. I think the nicest case is that of the Iranians, because really when we started showing Iranian cinema about 1990, Iran probably could not have been in a lower position of consideration for most Americans. I mean, it was, the terrorist capital. They had captured our embassy, all that kind of stuff. And, there was still a lot of bad feeling. And so when we announced our Iranian, films, our Iranian retrospective, Iranians came out in droves to support us. And more than a few came up and said, thank you. This is the first positive thing I've seen about Iran since I came to this country 10 years ago. And people also told me that at our gatherings that they were amazed because you'd see, it's a very divided community. You had people who are pro-Shah, you had people who are anti-Shah but anti-Khomeini, you had people who were less anti-Khomeini. I mean, you had a really wide range of people. And yet somehow our Iranian film programs became sort of, peaceful, what do you call it, peaceful ground, or not really no man's land, but just a kind of place where it would belong to everybody. And nobody seemed to go there to complain or attack other people. They were just all proud to be Iranians. and happy to see that there was a program at a cultural institution reflecting the brilliance of their culture.
It reminds me that I think you wrote about going to the Tehran Film Festival, and it strikes me, hearing about the two experiences, both your programming of Iranian work at Lincoln Center as well as reading your own account of the film festival in Tehran, it makes me wonder, do you think that film festivals can serve as a kind of diplomatic space, that they can go beyond film to encourage cross-cultural encounter, or how do you perceive that element?
Their best they could. I think that film festivals have been superseded by events. I think when film festivals were started right after World War II, I mean, Venice was started in 1932, but really the next major film festivals all began in 1946. Edinburgh, Locarno, Cannes, they all began right after the war. And in a certain way, it was almost the spirit of the United Nations. I mean, the idea of thinking of one world or whatever. And I think, as you say, there was a certain amount of cultural diplomacy that went on with regards to film festivals. However, as time's gone on, that exclusivity factor or whatever around festivals has just withered away. First of all, there's simply too many festivals, in my opinion. So because of that, that means that, a city like New York probably has 80 festivals of one sort or another. So it's even cheapened the word. And when I was growing up, when you talked about the festival, you meant the New York Film Festival. Now, nobody would really necessarily think that's what you're talking about. There's so many festivals that it could be any one. And as that happens, inevitably, the brand gets cheapened because, to be shown in a film festival at one point was a real honor. You got selected. Now, any film could get selected. There are so many film festivals out there. And plus you have these mega festivals, like, begun by places like Toronto or Seattle, where they show 300 plus films, which, I think whether people want to admit it or not, really almost does away with the factor of selection. They almost become a cross between festivals and markets. Because I think there's that little principle of selection that's going on. But be that as it may, that's how it goes on. But my sense is that the film festival as an institution is, I don't want to say it's on its way out, but I think it's lost a lot. I mean, we just have too much access to things. There's very little special about a festival anymore. I mean, the most special thing is usually getting to see the filmmakers in person. But even that happens other times,
Well, I was wondering, given this sort of dilution of the festival experience, something that I wondered looking at your CV is, who do you think, in the spirit of curatorial responsibility, who does a curator of film or art in general serve, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you serve everybody, because what you're trying to do is serve as a kind of guide to this enormous thicket of films that's out there. You're trying to say, okay, of these 7,000 or 8,000 films or more that are made every year, I don't know how many are made, here are 25 that we think are really important. Now, of course, we haven't seen everyone, but I mean, I think that's kind of the implication that, we've gone through a lot of films and we've really come up with what we think is a portrait of what's going on.
I mean, because there's a point in one of the interviews with Ken Jones where you describe that, quote, part of our challenge is to combat snap judgments, I suppose, about the perceived merits of a type of film. And so in the spirit of what the curator does, what do you believe is the role of the curator to educate? Are curators meant to shape the taste of the audience, or?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it sounds, as always, I'm always reminded, it sounds terribly egotistical, but I honestly think I know a lot more about films than most people. So because of that, I think, it's not that my taste is always right, but my taste comes from a long history of study and exposure and things like that. So what we're basically saying is, look, we've spent the time, we've put in the hours, we put in the study and the work to come up with what we think is really an exciting program that you might not come up with on your own. I think the dilemma now is you turn on Netflix and you see literally hundreds of titles and you have no idea where to go. You have no idea what is good, what might not be good, whatever. I mean, for some people, that's a certain kind of democratic paradise. For me, and hell, that I mean, it's just everything's thrown out there. when there's a curatorial aspect, then you begin to feel that someone's actually made a choice. You might disagree with their choices, but at least a choice has been made. And that seems a little retrograde to a lot of people, but that's how the festival was structured, and I think that's how it works.
So finding a kind of heaven in a hell of options.
Well, I mean, I think saying, there's all this, but here are the ones we think you should really pay attention to, And it's, look, no art produces a constant stream of masterpieces. I mean, whatever it is, most films are not worth watching, just like most novels aren't worth reading. And most albums aren't worth listening to. I mean, art is not democratic. It's always had that aspect of being quite elitist in its way, because unfortunately, not everybody has talent. But, it's important for us to try and point out those people who do, and to sort of look for that talent as openly and without prejudice as we can.
In that vein, what is the difference, Richard, between a curator, you find, and a critic?
Well, a critic is, I think, usually looking for, questions of worth or value according to his or her own criteria. That could be maybe the innovation that they feel in terms of the language or style of film. That could be about social importance. That could be about a lot, and it could be about popularity. I mean, whatever, that critic's criteria is for judging a film. A programmer ideally should have a bit of a longer view and should be able to think of a work, not just in terms of its immediate response from an audience, but in terms of its place within the director's work, within the actor's work, within the national cinema, within the time period. I mean, there are certain films that, it depends on, you have to go case by case, but there are some that films are such great revelations of the time that they were made. They tell you a lot about that. So, I mean, in a sense, even though you might complain about the film for certain things, on the other hand, it's a film that really reflects its era quite powerfully.
I mean, do you find, and this gets to my next question, the importance of the curator as an arbiter of film history? That part of the role is to take a film made in the present and situate it within a wider historical context?
Well, that would be ideal. I don't think most film curators that I've met know enough about film history to be able to function that way. But I mean, I think ideally, what I think a curator should do as opposed to a critic is, as I said, really operate from the longer view. I mean, there are people who have, certainly Andrew Sarris and the whole rise of auteurism was built on the presupposition that critics should have a longer view, that you can go see a John Ford film and you can respond to it, but you'll respond more intelligently to it if you understand Ford's work and you understand the relationship of this film to all the other ones he's made. And that was kind of, again, a historical argument. So you might, like Pauline Kael, go to see Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and make fun of it because you think, well, the Western heroes are too fat. But, as Sarris would say, if you see this film as the culmination of a man's lifetime reflection on what the West meant, then it's a different film.
So, I mean, in that spirit, maybe as a hypothetical to illustrate to our audience how one situates a film historically, I was wondering if you were to program A Touch of Sin, and I believe you did, so hooray, in the New York Film Festival, and then right across the way at the Walter Reed Theater, you said, I'm going to show films that would help situate A Touch of Sin within a broader historical continuum. What films would you choose, Richard?
I think there would certainly be a number of recent Chinese films, urban films or whatever, that show, again, one could say very generally speaking that Touch of Sin is a film that shows something like the seamy side of the Chinese miracle. That China has undergone or is living through a miracle can be doubted by no one. But on the other hand, that miracle's had victims. And I think this is a film about those people who haven't quite made it, that in a certain way they've become fodder for this machine. And I think there are a number of films that look at that in different ways. And I think that'd be one way of doing it. You could do something more comparative. You could look at other films that sort of look at, what you might think of as disappointed utopias, or something like that. People who are disappointed with the way that things turned out in their countries.
You spoke when you were here about how this film relates a little bit to a kind of Chinese action cinema as well. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I think that, in a certain way, obviously, even the English title is a little bit of a play on, A Touch of Zen by King Hu, the great masterpiece from, Hong Kong cinema. And even I think the character of Zhao Tai is very much based on the actor Xu Feng, who, plays in not only that film, but other films of King Hu, and often wears her hair in the exact same way and different things like that. So in that way, it's a little bit of an homage to that, because, again, the action becomes an expression of, what you do is you control, and then the action bursts forth.
It reminds me that after the screening, a few faculty members came up to me and said, Farid, when she takes her vengeance and poses, they both pantomimed the pose she struck, and she goes, that's straight out of the kinds of action cinema that we grew up on. So that
especially Touch of Zen.
And I feel for me, sort of hearing how you can so deftly relate A Touch of Sin to broader thematics, whether it be failed utopias on the one hand, to a broader constellation of Chinese cinema in terms of its formal tropes, it reminds me of this question that I had in terms of how Chinese cinema related to your programs specifically. I ask, as in, I believe, 1988, for your first New York Film Festival, you closed out the festival with the Chinese film Red Sorghum by Zhang Yimou. And it struck me, and the fact that you were doing later in your career Jia Zhangke and things like that, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit as we reflect on your experience with Chinese cinema, how you tried to bring Chinese cinema out in your programming, and how that shifted over time, how Chinese cinema was perceived at the beginning of your career versus towards its end at Lincoln Center.
Well, again, as I mentioned, it was really only in the mid-'80s, about 85, that I would say the general film-going audience got some inkling of what was going on in the People's Republic, and that was with the fifth-generation films, of which Red Sorghum is one of the classics. And so in a way, I was deeply moved by those films. And actually, even before I got to New York, when I was working at the Art Institute of Chicago, I did, the US premieres of quite a few of those films. So already I was really interested in it, excited. It felt like, I mentioned someplace, so like when Japanese cinema was discovered in the early 1950s, like someone opened up a treasure box and suddenly there were all these diamonds and jewels. And that's how I kind of felt about Chinese cinema, that suddenly we had the chance to not only see a lot of great new stuff, but to discover older things, older films from the 30s and 40s and all kinds. And of course, you had 3 different types of Chinese cinema to look at. So, it was really a very heady experience. So in that way, again, there was no conscious plan. It was clearly what was happening at the moment. In the same way in the 70s, what was happening was German cinema. Suddenly there was this incredible generation of German filmmakers, from Fassbinder to Wenders to, von Schlerndorf and people like that. And, that became part of the New York Film Festival, as well it should have, because that was really exciting work. 10 years later, it was China, and China went from being something very new and something very different to something very much expected. So Zhang Yimou was no longer, who is this guy? But, many people thought he was, one of the great filmmakers in the world, and I think in a certain way he was. So anyway, that was just it. I don't think the festival was doing anything different than it had done before, only now it was looking at Chinese cinema as opposed to German.
No, it's so in some ways a festival rides the wave of film production. So it goes in cycles. Sometimes it's Germany.
Yeah, I'd like to think it's more than ride the wave. That makes it sound like we're very passive.
That's true.
Clearly, I think one of the things that a festival wants to do is not only ride the wave, but help make the wave. And to buy, because obviously there are a lot of things happening at the same time. Some things you buy into, some things you don't. Some filmmakers you buy into, some filmmakers you don't. And so obviously, and especially that's true in a festival like New York, where we show a very small number of films. So because of that, New York always, took sides, made choices in ways that other festivals didn't have to.
Well, in the sort of the spirit of the intimacy of the New York Film Festival, I was struck in my attendance at the festival during your tenure about the opportunities to interact with filmmakers through master classes or Q&As. And it's something that, as you know, we've brought into our Global Perspectives on Society film series with you and other filmmakers, film scholars and filmmakers, is to bring a component of dialogue. And as I was preparing this interview, I wondered, perhaps on a meta level, what do you think makes a good Q&A? What, in your experience doing them, what do you think those contribute? What is the important part of the atmosphere? I was very curious about that element of a screening.
You know, it's not something I can put into quantitative terms, but as a moderator of Q&As, the important thing is not to get people to just answer a question, but to open up about a subject. So I mean, you want to make your questions precise in a certain way, but you want to make them broad enough so that people take the invitation to speak about much more. So, I mean, you might want to ask about one thing, but, you know, you'll get a quick answer back. That's not really fun. What's important is when you ask a filmmaker a question, and then he or she really takes that question and goes on to tell you about a lot of things you didn't ask about. So, I mean, as much as one can do that when you're moderating a Q&A, the better. And, you know, some of that's being prepared. Some of it is listening to what they say, you know, listening to what they say and then building on what they say, you know, other things like that.
Well, the way that a dialogue builds and sort of flows, it's very exciting and ideal for me, but looking at your trajectory, there was one point in your programming that I had a sense created some controversy that I just wanted to talk about because of how it illuminates potentially how a film festival can deal with a city or a place's traumatic history. I was struck in that Drones interview I mentioned. You discussed the issues surrounding showing a Godard film as the closing picture of the 2001 New York Film Festival right after the 9/11 attacks. And this opens up a broader question, and we've talked about it previously in private, questions that I've dealt with the program director of the Sarajevo Film Festival, which is how does a festival relate to and respond to local traumatic histories? Was that something that this experience allowed you to think through, or?
No, in fact, you know, basically that was just simply a question that, you know, we always pick the festival and then we pick what we might think of as our quote unquote prestige slots, you know, opening night, closing night, centerpiece. And in that year, if my memory serves me well, I think there was another film we thought about for closing night. And then for whatever reason, we decided against it. And we thought, gee, we really like the Godard film. We thought that would be an interesting closing night. So it was probably chosen by, say, August 10th. You know, and then of course 4 weeks later, you have 9/11. So, you know, we didn't choose the Godard film, which had a certain, I wouldn't call it anti-American, but, you know, it is critical of certain things about America. At Slant, we didn't choose it for that reason, but it just so happened that when the film came, some people took umbrage because at that point, people were so hypersensitive about any criticism of the United States. So anyway, it was just luck of the draw, but I was proud to show it, and some people walked out, but that was their right, you know.
Did you find that as in the post 9/11 period, because I know Tribeca was a film festival that was manifested after the attacks, did you find that that the New York Film Festival was negotiating how New York was changing during this time, or did you feel you always had a more global view in terms of the scope?
You know, I personally, I mean, I was affected by 9/11 like every other human being, but I mean, I certainly never thought now my programming has to change. Okay. I mean, I wanted to continue doing the exact same thing I'd always been doing. And, you know, if people were a little more sensitive about criticism of the U.S., you know, I can understand it, but I don't have to accept it. You know, so I mean, no, I don't think our programming changed at all after 9/11.
And that's helpful. In terms of changes, now you've sort of moved into a more full-time academic role, and it was something that I thought about, given that, you know, our series is within an academic setting. As a film professor, what possibilities do you find open up for how you treat film within the classroom? in an academic setting as opposed to within the more public-facing series of Lincoln Center? Did you find there's a difference? Are there different elements to those experiences, Richard?
Yeah, there are some. I mean, for example, when I was just in Sao Paulo teaching a class on cinema and anthropology, one of the things that was such a pleasure for me was having, in addition to my 22 students, a number of people from other departments at that university attending almost every class. Some of them, I think, did attend every class. And there were people from anthropology, from history, from different fields and whatever. So in a sense, they brought a lot of richness to the class discussions because, of course, they came with the films from their respective positions of expertise. That's an experience you only really can have in a university. You'll very rarely have that in a public setting. You might have real enthusiasts or even people who are quite knowledgeable. But, to be in a room with 40 people, 15 of whom are PhDs in various fields, talking about what you've just shown is a very special kind of pleasure, and I think a very special gift to the students, who I think really learned a lot from those discussions. So, academia, I think, if anything, can broaden the scope of film beyond film studies, and can bring it into many different areas because, of course, you have the proximity of all those people.
And do you find a screening, this is sort of my last question, do you find a screening at a place like NYU Shanghai, where we have, sort of a cross-cultural academic makeup from the very core? What does the screening of a film like A Touch of Shin in NYU Shanghai, and as part of our film series with you introducing the picture, how does that correspond, do you think, to the possibilities of film exhibition within an academic setting?
Well, I think you provided a very good context for the film. I think you brought in a wide range of people. I think I was probably a little surprised at how unknown the film was. That, speaking to people, I was amazed that many people there had never seen it. And, because the film was, I think, certainly not only a great film, but certainly one of the most discussed Chinese films in recent years, but I guess it hadn't reached, certain audiences and whatever. So I was very happy to be part of an effort that you had, of course, begun and organized that allowed a film like that to suddenly be considered within an academic setting. So I think that was the important thing. But I was a little bit surprised that people hadn't heard more about it. But maybe that's because the film didn't really get a release in China.
Yeah, I think it was really exciting for us to have your more full-bodied view of the film, bringing it into a wider history, and your note about how a film, and it's from that opening trailer we saw. One of what was the quote again? One of the best and most important directors in the world, in one view, and how in another audience that same director might not have as much cachet. So I thought it was really exciting that you were allowing us a space to appreciate Jia's vital, exhilarating, and violent cinema. So it was so exciting to have the opportunity to talk with you, Richard. I hope we can continue the conversation real soon, and thank you so much for taking time to talk with me.
Okay, Fried, pleasure. Say hi to everyone there for me.
I will. Thanks so much, Richard. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.